Today, you'll hear what it was like to serve in fire bases during the Vietnam War, isolated in the middle of hostile territory and surrounded by an enemy that was always watching you. We'll show you how these bases operated, their purpose, and in the end, tell you the story of how one of them was overrun in a horrific surprise attack. Let's begin. So what exactly are fire bases? Also known as fire support bases, these were heavily fortified outposts designed to provide artillery support for infantry operations over a wide area. They also served as key locations to launch patrols, control territory, and maintain a constant US presence in hostile regions. Built in strategic locations deep within enemy territory, fire bases functioned much like medieval forts, projecting power, controlling the surrounding land, and acting as defensive strongholds. But why were they used in this way, and what made serving on one such a terrifying experience? The US had exceptional air support in Vietnam, as the entire war heavily relied on air mobility and firepower. However, when you need fire support available 24/7 in any weather conditions, you depend on field artillery. But artillery has a limited range, and in Vietnam's terrain, it was impossible to use it in the traditional way since there were no clear front lines. To support advancing ground forces deep in enemy territory, tactics had to change. Temporary forward locations were occupied and fortified in the middle of the jungle. These positions, acting as small forts, housed artillery batteries protected by an infantry company. From here, the artillery could provide 360-degree support at any moment, ready to respond to threats or assist nearby units. Fire bases were scattered across South Vietnam, surrounded by dense jungle and the ever-present enemy. It doesn't sound very safe, does it? And if you're wondering whether they were attacked or even overrun, the answer is yes. Many times. You'll hear about those stories in a moment. Most of these bases operated like isolated islands, completely cut off from the rest of the force by land. They were established, supplied, and evacuated entirely by air, as supplying them by road was far too dangerous, offering the enemy countless opportunities to ambush convoys attempting to reach the base. While some bases were connected by roads, most relied on helicopters to bring in men, supplies, and even guns or vehicles. Larger bases even had airstrips where C-130 Hercules planes could land, along with CH-47 Chinook helicopters for heavier loads. Smaller bases, however, relied on Hueys for their resupply missions. So, how were fire bases made? Infantry and artillery commanders worked together to find a position that could provide support to nearby units and even mutual support to other bases. The location also needed to be strategically positioned so it could be well defended by infantry and easily supplied by air. Once a suitable location was identified, the first task was to clear the area. Bulldozers, explosives, or napalm were used to remove vegetation and create an open space. The immediate priority was to establish a defensive perimeter while the base was being fortified. It was important to clear vegetation in a wide circle around the base to deny the enemy cover from which they could launch surprise attacks closer to the base. The cleared area also gave defenders a clear line of fire. Sometimes, however, specific sections of vegetation were intentionally left intact to lure the enemy into hiding there. These spots were carefully zeroed in by artillery, ensuring that during an attack, enemy forces seeking cover would be decimated by precise fire. Depending on the base's size and how long it was intended to be used, detailed fortifications and infrastructure would then be constructed. Typically, work began in the morning, and by nightfall, the artillery guns were dug in with overhead cover and infantry defenses in place. Additional fortifications and infrastructure would be completed in the following days. Artillery pieces were strategically positioned to be as effective as possible for both offensive and defensive operations. Sometimes different bases could provide mutual fire support, covering each other in case of an attack. Typically, a battery of 6 guns was arranged in a star formation. 5 guns positioned at each point of the star, with the 6th placed in the center. The central gun was used for self-illumination during nighttime operations but could also assist in fire missions to support the other guns. This formation ensured 360-degree coverage, leaving no blind spots. In smaller bases with only 3 or 4 guns, they were arranged in triangle or diamond formations, allowing each gun to cover a specific direction while still supporting the others when needed. The guns were placed in circular gun pits, reinforced with sandbags and metal sheets, offering protection to the crew from incoming fire, which was common in many areas. The primary artillery pieces were 105 and 155mm howitzers. They could fire high explosive, smoke, illumination, and anti-personnel beehive rounds for close protection when all lines of defense were breached. You're about to hear more about that in just a moment. Besides howitzers, fire bases were equipped with 81 and 60mm mortars, as well as recoilless rifles for direct fire and anti-armor roles. Some bases even had tanks and armored vehicles for additional protection. The guns were prepared with pre-designated points of fire to ensure maximum effectiveness. In desperate situations during intense attacks, the artillery would fire in high arcs for the closest possible range, or even directly at the enemy to defend the base perimeter. A particularly interesting technique used by artillery was the so-called Killer Junior direct fire method. This method involved setting time fuses so the shell would explode approximately 30 feet off the ground, at ranges as close as 200 to even 100 meters from the base. The result was a devastating airburst, scattering shrapnel over a wide area, leaving no way to hide without overhead cover. However, this technique was extremely dangerous and required absolute precision to avoid hitting friendly forces. And why was it called Killer Junior? Because there was also Killer Senior, the same method but executed using an 8-inch howitzer. Now, you can imagine the effects of that. Firebases were protected by a multi-layered defensive perimeter. The first layer consisted of thick rows of barbed wire encircling the entire base. In front of and around the wire were tripwires designed to trigger grenades or flares, which alerted defenders to infiltration attempts. Flares would illuminate the enemy soldiers' position, and you can imagine what would happen next. Beyond the barbed wire, the area was scattered with claymores, anti-personnel mines, and various booby traps to slow down or inflict casualties on the enemy if they breached the wire. Observation towers and listening posts were positioned at strategic points and manned around the clock, especially at night when most infiltration attempts occurred. Patrols were frequently sent around the perimeter to check for enemy activity and set booby traps or ambushes. However, the base was often surrounded by Viet Cong booby traps, which caused many casualties among patrols. Firebases also relied on sensors, ground surveillance radars, and an early night vision device known as the Starlight Scope to detect enemy movements and give defenders an early warning. Infantry bunkers and the trench line surrounding the base formed the core of its defense, fortified with M60 or M2 machine guns. Although the base was physically isolated, it was actually part of a much larger system and far from alone. In addition to mutual fire support from nearby bases, gunships could be called in, and quick reaction force was always on standby to reinforce a base under heavy attack. However, reinforcements often arrived too late, as the fighting would already be over by the time they reached the base. During sieges, helicopters had to fly in under enemy fire to evacuate the wounded and resupply the base with ammunition, food, and water. Some sieges were so intense that entire bases had to be evacuated. For example, at Firebase Ripcord, 75 US soldiers were killed, hundreds were wounded, and after 23 days of heavy fighting, the base had to be evacuated by helicopters under heavy enemy fire. Besides night infiltrations by sappers attempting to plant explosives on guns, ammo depots, or throw satchel charges into bunkers, another major threat came from the NVA's Soviet-supplied artillery, which significantly outranged most US guns. For instance, the Soviet M46 130mm field gun had an effective range of 17 miles, while the commonly used US howitzers had ranges of only 7 to 14 miles. This advantage allowed the NVA to shell US bases from camouflaged and fortified positions that were beyond the reach of US counter-battery fire. Mortars and recoilless rifles were also used to constantly harass troops inside the base. These weapons could be quickly set up, fired, and moved to avoid counterfire. The NVA often aimed to strike soldiers sleeping in tents, damage helipads, or, with a lucky shot, hit an ammo depot, triggering a catastrophic explosion capable of devastating the base. Now here is the story of what happened at Firebase Maryanne. On the night of March 27, 1971, the base was manned by 231 men. Enemy activity in the area had been minimal recently, and the base was scheduled to be handed over to South Vietnamese forces soon. Despite reports of NVA activity in the region, the lack of recent attacks led to complacency and the defenses became lax. However, around 2:30 a.m., a group of about 50 NVA sappers began gathering near the base perimeter. Moving slowly and silently, they cut through 3 layers of barbed wire completely undetected. They crept to within 20 meters of the bunker line, watching the sleeping soldiers and waiting for the mortar attack to signal the beginning of the ground assault. When the mortars opened fire, the sappers scattered across the base, moving swiftly toward key targets. They threw satchel charges into bunkers and command posts, killing soldiers as they slept in their tents. The attack was a complete surprise, catching the American forces off guard. Tear gas and grenades added to the chaos as the sappers advanced through the base, destroying bunkers and defensive positions. The attack created complete confusion among the defenders. Artillery support was requested, but the situation wasn't immediately understood, delaying the response. The speed and surprise of the attack prevented Maryanne's own guns from firing, as their crews were fighting for their lives. Many bunkers caught fire and a case of white phosphorus ignited. Most of the command staff were killed in the opening moments, leaving the soldiers to fight in total chaos as the sappers moved behind the sandbagged trenches before they could be fully manned. Artillery fire eventually began landing around the base, but gunships were delayed due to the confusion. By the morning, the sappers had broken contact and withdrawn, leaving 33 Americans dead and 83 wounded. If you want to hear more about such battles, we have a video about the 77-day siege at Khe Sanh that you can now watch.